Today's video is going to be a bit of an interesting one, mostly a theoretical video of my own. Some of it is right, some of it is wrong. I think it highlights some interesting ideas regarding the modern interpretation of existential nihilism and radical activism within the spirit of our modern age, or more specifically in the new generation of young people today who are around my age or a few years younger or older than me, and how in many ways it is presenting itself. I've been reading a book called Nihilism, the Root of the Revolution in the Modern Age. It seems to be that a few of his ideas in the book in a way made me rethink of a few of my own and how in some ways they are better described. Sorsham Rose created an idea called the nihilistic dialectic, and it basically encapsulates 4 phases of nihilism in the modern age, which are liberalism, realism, vitalism, and complete nihilistic destruction, which is, in a sense, its last and purest formation. The author basically accepts the Nietzschean interpretation of nihilism, that the existence of objective truth, absolute truth, has been done away with and been replaced with relativism, subjectivism, or empiricism. I could talk about the complete dialectic, but today I just want to talk about realism and vitalism in relation to the modern age, the death of God, and the insufficiency that realism brings when it comes to something like existential relief, which I would say religion offered in heaps. Now, when I am talking about realism, I am specifically talking about scientism, materialism, naturalism, and logical positivism, as does in the book. You might be a bit confused in why he refers to it as nihilism. He does so because if truth is in the highest sense knowledge of the beginning and end of things, of the dimension of the absolute, and if nihilism is the doctrine that there is no such truth, such as that, then it is clear that those who take scientific knowledge for the only truth and deny what tries above it are nihilists in the exact sense of that term. That is exactly how he describes it. Oh, and by the way, the man who wrote this was a religious man. He saw ultimate truth in God, which allowed him to develop a religious perspective on nihilism. He accepted Nietzsche's definition of nihilism, which is, I quote, that there is no truth, that there is no absolute state of affairs, no thing in itself. This alone is nihilism, and of the most extreme kind, end quote. He sees these people who follow realism as having nothing on faith, that they take everything through the scientific lens with absolute and exclusive truth, that they reject abstraction and idealism for the concrete and factual, bows before no authority and respects nothing. He attacks realism by saying the following, which I think is a very interesting critique to say the least. I quote, "Realism, a logical self-contradiction, is not properly treated as a philosophy at all. It is naive, undisciplined thought of the unreflective, practical man who, in our age of oversimplification, thinks to impose his simple-minded standards and ideas upon the entire world, or on a slightly different level, the equally naive thought of the scientist, bound to the obvious by the requirements of his speciality, when he illegitimately attempts to extend scientific criteria beyond their proper bounds." End quote. He's basically attacking the scientism, and not what he calls legitimate science. He hates its exploitation in the modern world, but he is not attacking science as a means of knowledge, just the ideological metaphysics behind how these think tanks populate themselves in society. Throughout the following pages in regards to realism and scientism, he talks about how its nihilistic metaphysics conjoins to the making of something like Marxist realism, and how the radically simple solutions that were presented by the likes of Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, and Stalin. I quote, "The Christian has found the only answer in God and his Son. The realist, out of contact with Christian life and the truth that animates it, asks the question in a spiritual vacuum and is content to accept the first answer he finds. Mistaking Christianity for another form of idealism, he rejects it and becomes a fanatical devotee of the only reality that is obvious to the spiritually blind, this world. Now, much as it is possible to admire the earnestness of the devoted materialist and atheist, Not even the greatest charity can induce us to recognise in him of a love of truth that has gone astray, become a disease, and ended in its own negation. The motives of the realist are in fact not pure. He claims to know what, by his own theory and knowledge, cannot be known. We have seen the denial of absolute truth is itself an absolute, and if he does so, it is because he has an ulterior motive, because he places some other worldly value above truth." End quote. And then he goes on to talking about the Nietzschean Superman being a so-called truth seeker, trying to excavate the true man. He links this to Marxist realism and revolutionary rebellion, how the love for truth is prostituted for an irrational cause, and how that itself becomes an enemy of truth and destroys the premise for truth itself. But what really interests me in this book, above all his other ideas, is his view on vitalism. He basically states, and Nietzsche does also, that science as it is of itself is not capable of completely replacing the death of God, which is where nihilism essentially sprouted from in his opinion. One reason why is because it doesn't bring about any existential relief. So what Father Rose says is that vitalism is introduced to bring about a pseudo-religiosity or pseudo-spirituality, which is a reaction against the realist simplifications which are presented through scientism, positivism and materialism. This vitalism is brought about because the simplification of reality doesn't bring about any kind of transcendental punch to the soul. For example, you can see how Marxism, even though they were atheists, had a pseudo-religious twang with how they represented the proletariat or the new man. And of course, you had vitalism in the environment of psychedelics, and of course modern and postmodern art, where the idea of whatever is most physically outstanding wins the prize, as that is the only designation when a society's value systems are made null and void. Anything that is the opposite of traditionalism is the winner because it is a continuous progression away from the past. As in the past we had values, so therefore that is the only direction a nihilistic society can go, for example. So in response to today, is there a representation of science being infused with a form of pseudo-religious spiritual vitalism due to its simplifications being too bland for the young? Or for it to replace the death of God, to serve a purpose, a cathartic distraction away from the nihilism of humanity in the constant attempt for the search of meaning? I would say yes. I think the repercussions of climate change is a perfect example. Young people in an age of atheism, in an age of nihilism, at its highest degree than ever before, have never loved science so dearly. Science itself, as said by Nietzsche, cannot replace God, but it can, I believe, if given the supposed perfect cause, and if you can fulfill the empty slot which religion holds and science does not. And that is, as I said before, existential relief. Climate activism does that perfectly, especially for the young lost people of today. And who else better than little Greta Thunberg, the new Jesus, to forward this religious activism? And then of course, the organisation Extinction Rebellion, who basically partake in pseudo-spiritual ritual nearly every time they do a demonstration. So it's very, very interesting, and it made me think of an idea I thought of recently in relation to nihilism, which I call cathartic nihilism. Because all of this activism everywhere, especially today, which was never really there at such an immensity before the death of God, as Nietzsche claimed, all follows a nihilistic trend in the specific relation to human existence with regards to existential meaning, and that is that all human action from the past presents itself as being meaningless. Therefore, dedication to something that will bring me a catharsis, a relief against a specifically meaningless existence of humanity itself, to bring myself relief from the nihilism of human existence, to dedicate myself to something beyond me as a person, beyond me as a human, with pseudo-religiosity, so that it acts as a useful distraction from my own and the new generation of humanity's modern nihilism. And I think this is existent in many forms of radical thinking within activism today, especially in climate activism, some areas around veganism, and in anti-natalism. It could be said that anti-natalism is the embodiment of cathartic nihilism, because the anti-natalist would actually get a relief, a catharsis, by knowing that people will stop continuing to exist. To dedicate my life in being an anti-natalist, preaching that there is no real beneficial value to existence, so therefore you shouldn't have children. They are in a way contradictory, because if they actually believed that there was more suffering than pleasure within this idea of the asymmetry of pleasure and pain, then they would actually do themselves in, because they would realise that doing so would prevent them from further lifelong suffering, and doing so would outweigh any pleasure that they experience on a pleasure to pain basis, because they know that they wouldn't be contending with the remains of their lifelong suffering. But they don't do that. Obviously, suicide is an extremely difficult attempt when it comes to willpower and mental fortitude, and I hope that no one ever attempts to do so, because people have so much unrealised potential for good. But if these anti-natalists were really dedicated to such a belief in the philosophy's full embodiment, they would do it, wouldn't they? But obviously there are pleasurable things in life that are valuable, that do outweigh the pain presented to us in the world, which are worth living for. But continuing the existence of life is a disease and an immoral act to them, maybe even a sin. And what is the purest form of nihilism? Destruction. How would you destroy everything? You would have to destroy mankind. Everything ever known, gone. Another area I think it is active in is in veganism. By those who go out on the streets with anonymous masks and present to the unconsenting public animal cruelty, which is blindly normalised in the animal industry, which is obviously wrong, which I'm completely against. The reason why I think this activism is a form of cathartic nihilism is because these activists, especially the radical activists, not all vegans of course, don't care, or in his or her radical activism has no relational value system with regards to the public people or the people who are not them, as they may refer. They care in expressing the truth, don't get me wrong, but they don't seem to care about the means of expressing that truth. So therefore the public, or the people, or the child that is more than likely to be mentally scarred by seeing such animal brutality publicly displayed for everyone to see. So people who are against snuff films, for example, which I hope everyone is by the way, are not going to start publicly displaying these disgusting films on large flat screen TVs to the unconsenting public who already know about their existence as a form of activism. Well, I hope they don't, because it is disturbing and therefore violating public consent. And no one wants to see that shit anyway. We already know about it. We already know about these types of things. So bring some kind of consent into it with regards to vegan demonstrations like this. But on top of that, they also wear an anonymous mask. Why? One reason is obviously because they want people to pay attention to what they are showing, for there to not be any other distractions to that which is needed of the highest attention, but it is also for them to not be publicly responsible for what they are showing, because if they did, I'm sure they would get a lot of nasty looks for a start, and also because it is a form of catharsis. Wearing a mask detaches a person from the rest of society. If you're going to condemn humans, human activity, and to be nihilistic about them in general, what better way to do it than by detaching yourself from the rest of them? As being a cathartic nihilist, you get a relief by condemning humans in general with regards to their traditional, long-lived activities. It is very interesting how all these three causes for activism are in some way or another all related. So many associate themselves to all three, which is climate activism, veganism, and anti-natalism in their most radical expressions. When I'm talking about this, I'm mostly referring to the radicals, but it is also the radicals that are the ever-growing dimension in society. Young people today are extremely radicalized, even in America, and the major reason for this radicalism is, I think, only because it gives some kind of meaning to people's lives in an age of nihilism. So you get these people hypnotized with an aggressive, nihilistic Thanatos-like state, similar to how Freud described the death drive. And it won't come as a surprise, especially in America, for a democratic structure, or a liberal democracy, if there ever was one, to completely fall apart in the future due to systematic nihilism among the young generation, who find meaning in their lives by attaching themselves to anarchist political groups. But as I have described, this cathartic nihilism, which is in response to the contemporary interpretation of meaning, value and modern human existence, leads simply to the devotion of what all these three forms of activism associate: climate change. The catharsis or existential relief is rooted in worshipping that which is furthest away from being human itself, which is either negation of human existence, animals or the planet. These three ideals bring about attention away from the nihilism of human existence to something beyond human itself. Thus, pseudo-religiosity or pseudo-spirituality towards such said interests are understandable. Radical worship, as it is acted out by the radicals themselves, is understandable when accepting this philosophy. When looking at the structure of cathartic nihilism, sacrificing the human is the root core, unaccepted or accepted endgame of this philosophy. How can the climate, God, for example, be fulfilled, or what is the best way to reduce CO2 emissions? Or what is the best way to fulfill complete catharsis? Antinatalism gives the most radical answer to this question, even if it does not yet accept it yet in its complete formation. Just how nihilism's complete embodiment is destruction itself. Complete relief would be fulfilled for the cathartic nihilist if only the human existence can be imploded from reality. The most cathartic thing to do, to distract one away from the accepted nihilism of human existence, would be to end it entirely, instead of devoting oneself towards what brings about a condemnation of human activity, which stems the catharsis itself, such as climate activism, veganism, or antinatalism, a pagan-like sacrifice for the climate, self-inflicted or not, may be the final solution for an enduring philosophy like cathartic nihilism. But that is if it even exists. That is, as I am hypothesizing here, in relation to the behaviours of radical expressions within these groups. So yeah, what do you think of that? Just to make sure to anyone watching this video who is offended, I am mostly talking about the possible psychology behind the radical expression of certain activism among the young generation in regards to this realm of activism, and it is specifically relating to the radical expression. So I'd love to see what you thought of this video. Make sure to give it a like if you enjoyed it, comment your thoughts down below, subscribe, and I hope you have a lovely day. Thanks for watching.